My name is Spencer Fluhman. I'm Executive Director of the Neil A. Maxwell Institute at Brigham Young University. I'm here with Patrick Mason, the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies and Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Claremont Graduate University. Did I get that all right?
No, but it was close.
We are...
Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities.
It was so close.
It was close.
I felt confident.
It was close, but I don't know anything about sciences.
Good point. We're going to steer away from science today. We're here to talk as part of what we're calling the Big Questions Project. And we're going to talk today about a significant religious and, in some ways, academic question, but it's a pressing religious one for Latter-day Saints. We've both been teaching about Mormonism as academics for a long time, but we're both heavily invested Latter-day Saints in the conversation as well. So I think both parts of us come to a question about prophets and authority and the community of saints with a lot of energy and interest. We have an audacious claim as Latter-day Saints that prophets aren't historical or mythical in the sense of being biblical only. We recognize modern prophets and apostles. It's audacious. It makes us unlike other religious traditions in some ways, and the questions that it forces on Latter-day Saints. And it seems to be a question that's always pressing, but for our generation, it's unavoidably so. You've been thinking about this for a long time. Get us started.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. That this is one of the really strong claims that Latter-day Saints make.
Yeah.
That God, as part of the restoration of the gospel, that he reached down and appointed a certain handful of men to be prophets and seers and revelators among us. And it begins with Joseph Smith and continues that it's a continuous stream, that it's not just kind of one prophet of the restoration, but there's a continuous line until today. And this bold claim that God continues to talk to those prophets and reveal his mind and will for the contemporary church and contemporary world, right? I mean, here we are in a world of, 7 billion people, and there's, 15 million of us, and there's this claim that the man at the head of the church speaks for God, speaks on behalf of God to the world. Those are strong claims, and in some ways, they're unintelligible to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And
a collective eye roll.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think there's a comfort level with biblical prophets. There's the kind of haziness of history and almost relegating them to myth.
Yeah.
I think in our culture, we have come to appreciate certain people as having a kind of prophetic voice, somebody like a Martin Luther King, who speaks against injustice and speaks, in a way that we recognize in some ways, the voice of God calling us to a higher plane of existence. But the idea that a prophet would speak for God and have institutional authority at the same time, be a prophet and a church president, that has created a lot of questions for people, even while it has given tremendous power to the claims we make as Latter-day Saints.
It's remarkable. Both of us are historians. We come at this knowing that this is especially audacious in a democratic republic to be making these claims and to hammer out a community that respects prophetic authority or depends on prophetic authority. So there's that tension between Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints, but it also creates a kind of tension for Latter-day Saints themselves. And I'm wondering if you could think through that, if we could think through that together. Because on the one hand, Latter-day Saints valorize, celebrate that kind of living voice quality of the claim, right? That it's not in the past. It's not God spoke. It's God speaks. It's not a period, it's a comma, right? It's still going. So there's that part of us as Latter-day Saints that treasure that want that. But there's also all the questions that come with it. There's questions about fallibility, about the humanness of these men, about the fact that they're men, about that. So there's all these questions that come with that for modern Latter-day Saints. Where are we at as a community? Where have we been? what are ways of thinking through all of those complexities that come with the claim?
Yeah, well, I think we have a strong doctrine of prophets in the sense that a kind of revealed and authoritative statement that God has called prophets in the last days. And this is a bedrock claim.
No one's backing off of that. No one's like, let's rethink that.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
But I think what we haven't fully done is to think through the theology of prophets. And what I mean by that, and the difference between doctrine and theology, doctrine is something that's received, it's revealed, there's a kind of authority that comes behind it. You and I don't just get to make up doctrine, right?
Yeah.
But theology is a reasoned reflection upon doctrine. And all of us as members of the community, as part of a faith community, we all participate in this theological process. So I may not have the authority, and I don't have the authority to set doctrine, but it is incumbent upon me to think about the theology of this.
Yeah.
How do I think through what it means to have a prophet? So there's a claim, but then how do I think through the implications of that claim? That's what the theological project is. And anybody can do that. Church leaders can do that. You and I can do this. I mean, everybody in the pews does this in their own way.
I was going to say, it's almost unavoidable.
You have to do it.
Every Sunday, in a Sunday school class, we're all teasing out the implications of this doctrine or that doctrine. We're theologizing whether we want to admit it or not.
That's right. And it may not be capital T theology.
May not be very good.
Right, exactly. But we all do it.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the tasks before us now that we have this very well-established doctrine of prophets is to think through the theology of what that means for us individually, but also as a church. Because as you said, there are real challenges that come with this doctrine, because we know that these are ordinary men who are called, and they don't take on some kind of supernatural or extraordinary quality. Their natures aren't inherently changed at the moment that hands are laid on their head and they become ordained as an apostle or
They're not suspended somewhere between mortality and immortality. It's not like quasi-mortality that they're still in the world with us.
They are, and they retain their agency as well. I think sometimes we have slipped into a mode of the kind of prophets as the marionette for God. God is a kind of ventriloquist just speaking through these prophets. We know Joseph Smith didn't feel that way about even his own revelations. I mean, he went back and edited them. He was always searching for the right language because he didn't believe that he was just an empty vessel that God was speaking through.
Yeah.
And the same is true for our modern prophets. So thinking through what that means, that they're mortal men, they're fallible, they retain their agency, which is at the core of Mormon theology. God couldn't take away their agency because he'd be violating the whole nature of the plan. So they retain their agency even while they have this remarkable calling and vocation. So that introduces a lot of layers of complexity and even problems about what do we do with our agency as human beings? We screw up with it. We make mistakes, as President Uchtdorf has said. Even leaders of the church have made mistakes in their roles as church leaders, as prophets, seers, and revelators. And so those are the kinds of hard questions that people look at, because they say if a prophet is wrong about one thing,
That's a slippery slope argument.
how do I trust
Where's my
the
trust,
rest of what
right?
he said?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So if we've got this, if we don't have a formal position of infallibility, and I don't think we do, and I don't think the modern revelations lay out a kind of claim for infallibility. So if we, like prophets and apostles, are in this mortal experience, shot through with all the complexities of social location and cultural influence and agency and so on, where I can imagine a Latter-day Saint, and I can imagine a young Latter-day Saint in myself of finding it to be a very comforting, almost passive approach to prophetic utterances is part of the answer then of why can't this be easier, the younger me says.
Right.
Is the answer, well, it actually demands more of me. Is that kind of where we're left, you and me?
Well, it has to be, because so if agency is one core of Mormon theology, another fundamental element of it is that each of us is on a path to our own exaltation. And we can't simply abdicate any of our moral or ethical authority to another person, right? We oftentimes talk about you can't live off borrowed light, you can't live off of somebody else's testimony. Well, the same thing. I can't simply abdicate moral responsibility to any other person, including somebody who I raise my hand and say, sustain as a prophet, seer, and revelator. So the responsibility is always on me to have an affirmation of these kinds of claims that the prophet is making, to come to a knowledge of these teachings for myself, to come to a conviction of what that means in my Christian discipleship, and not just passively go along. Now, I think sustaining should be a rich and robust concept for us in terms of giving them the benefit of the doubt, being willing to consecrate our hearts and minds and bodies to Zion and be part of this grand enterprise. But it doesn't mean that we flip off the switch of inquiry or of seeking greater light and knowledge and simply saying we're going to let the prophets do all of this for us. Because that also would be fundamentally antithetical to the plan that God has for each one of us. He's not just trying to save the prophets, He's trying to exalt each one of us. So it's not good enough for the prophets to figure it out and me just follow along passively.
One of the things you just said kind of grabbed me about giving them the benefit of the doubt, and I think that's a thing that most Latter-day Saints are willing to do. Mm-hmm. I think. Mm-hmm. I think, and that maybe that is itself the act of faith, right? That tie goes to the prophets. Is that a rule that we could, that we could, is that an LDS rule that is unstated but operative? What about those moments? This is one of the most difficult places for a Latter-day Saint to be in. It's often done privately. It's often grappled with somewhat quietly. What if, given that generous reading of prophets and apostles, what about that moment, that difficult moment for the Latter-day Saint where, I'm willing to give that generous reading, but what about that moment with past or present statement where I can't square myself with it?
Yeah.
We don't talk about this a lot. When we do, it often tends to be somewhat superficial. There are heavy-handed versions of this. Just assume you're wrong. If you ever come in conflict, if your conscience comes up against prophetic statement, chances are you're wrong. Right. And there are other versions of that, but I think that can be a disorienting and difficult place for a Latter-day Saint to be. I think we can be good to each other by making this conversation both charitable, but maybe a little bit more rich, because I think this is. There's part of me that thinks this is intentional. Mm-hmm. There's part of me, I think it happens enough. I watch my church history students grapple with it. Yeah. That they come up against this thing or that statement, and they come to this moment where it's like, I can't endorse that. It doesn't square with my sense of the way God's worked with me or the way that I see. What do we do in that difficult space? And I think we can acknowledge that as a difficult place for Latter-day Saints to be.
Yeah, because we can all point to plenty of moments in the church's past, and it's easier to do with the past, right? Yeah. It becomes much more difficult when we're talking about current things.
Sure.
But, so we always start with examples from the past, and that gives us a foundation, a platform to think about these things. But I think you're exactly right. This, Joseph Smith talked about through truth is found through proving contrary, sort of kind of working through the paradoxes. Gene England used to talk about this all the time as well. And I think that is the nature of the moral experience. And it starts in the garden. You've got conflicting goods. Yeah. And that's oftentimes what the moral experience is about. I mean, conscience versus community. Those are both good things. And how do we navigate those? I think we have to approach these questions first and foremost as Christians. And I think if these paradoxes are not refining our character as Christians, then we're not coming at it the right way, and the paradoxes aren't doing the job that they're intended to do. And so to come at these with the Christian virtues, you mentioned charity, to really examine ourselves, and are my questions, is even my opposition, is this coming from a place of love?
Yeah.
to have a deep sense of humility, to always keep in mind that I might be wrong. I think you're right. It can be a little heavy-handed that, oh, you're definitely wrong if you ever disagree.
That can feel alienating.
That can be very alienating, but I think we always have to ask ourselves, I'm on this side of the veil too. There's no reason why I should think that I have greater clarity of view than one of my fellow human beings,
Yeah.
And so that kind of epistemic humility and a kind of generosity. So all that can be done while also saying that I will stand by my convictions. I will seek personal revelation. And if it has come to me through the ways that I've understood the Holy Spirit to work upon my mind and soul, that I'm going to stand in a slightly different position, then that opens up a whole new set of conversations about what I do with that. But I always lead with the Christian virtues.
I'm thinking of instances in church history. There's this great moment where Brigham Young is basically saying to someone with whom he's had a very sharp disagreement, you didn't know that part of the purpose of the priesthood was to try you, to be tried by the priesthood. Right. And he's kind of frankly acknowledging that I've just been hard on you and we're not seeing this the same way. And you've now got a choice with what you're going to do with my heavy leadership.
Right.
And it's almost like Brigham Young was very self-aware in this particular exchange of, I know I've just been hard on you, but he realized that now you've got a choice. You have a choice about how you're going to deal with this fissure or this question or this paradox between you and your leader or the institution or the presumed voice of God or whatever. And I'm compelled by what you've said.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about not reducing people to our conflicts with them or to their worst day. Or to their worst pronouncement, but having a kind of generosity to look, to step back, take a breath, and look at the whole. I mean, for me, there are there are challenges in our past. There are statements and actions by some of our prophets, people I believe to be prophets, that for me seem to cut against my understanding of Christianity. But it's oftentimes those exact same people who have taught me how to be a Christian.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so the funny thing here is the standard that I'm applying to them, I learned from them.
Yeah.
And some of the most important things I've learned about being a Christian have come from being in community with them. And so being able to step back and then also to think really intentionally about how we deploy some of these questions that we might have. Do I have... Is it my place in a Sunday school class, to voice these kinds of things? Maybe in a certain way, and depending on the kind of relationships that I have, because we want those places to be sites of honesty and integrity and authenticity, but also recognize what is the purpose of us coming together for that 3-hour block.
Yeah.
Are these things sometimes better voiced elsewhere? I think part of the problem is sometimes people feel so alone. And they don't know who to talk to about these things, and they oftentimes don't have even when they voice even a little bit of this, they get shut down.
Yeah, they feel shut down by a family member or a church leader or a Sunday school classmate.
That's right.
And so that alienation.
And so they feel like they can't be authentic in that 3-hour block. So I'm really sympathetic to that. And so how do people find a listening ear? A conversation partner. I think you and I have been able to do that partly by virtue of the professions that we've followed and the kinds of communities that we've helped create. But it's, I think, one of the most difficult things is a lot of people feel isolated and alienated and unable to even work through these things because they can't even start to express them.
Yeah. Well said. Well, I think as we go for Latter-day Saints, for modern Latter-day Saints, to maintain such strong, in some ways, high-stakes claims about the kinds of religious authority that we prize, that has given us both identity and direction through all the kind of cultural upheavals that we've been through as a community over the years and all the varied places we're in across the world. I think those conversations are going to have to be real, and they're going to have to be compelling, and they're going to have to be rich. So thanks for starting us.
Yeah, and I think they're never easy. I think this is part of what it means to be a believer in a time of skepticism, to be able to stick by these bold claims and say there's power in that, and then work through the consequences.
Wonderful. Thank you.